All right. So thanks very much, everyone, for joining us today. My name is Matt Levitt. I am the agronomist with the University of Minnesota Forever Green Initiative. And the whole impetus for this call is to kind of create some learning around a crop that some of you may or may not be intimately familiar with, which is winter barley. The University of Minnesota has been actively breeding this crop. And we're kind of at the stage now where we are close to developing, there's a commercial variety out there, and, really what we're all about at the University of Minnesota Forever Green is kind of creating a consortium of research and development efforts, so kind of on the breeding and development side, and then pushing that forward into kind of the commercialization space as well. So creating, downstream opportunities for farmers to move this crop out into the landscape and make it more of a viable crop moving forward for larger acreages. And to that effect, we realized that that's not going to happen overnight. So one of the things that we've started to do, and one of the kind of impetus for my role, if I'll start my slideshow here, just bear with me 1 minute. Can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Super. Thank you. All right. So the impetus for this call is a program from the state of Minnesota, which we are a partner with, and is also partially funding my role in addition to a lot of these activities, which is the Economic and Environmental Clusters of Opportunity program, or the EECO program. So I'm going to level set a little bit about why we're here, why we're learning about these crops, and then I'm going to kick things over to UofM Wiersma, who's a small grain specialist here at the University of Minnesota. And then we're going to hear from two different farmers, one from Minnesota, one from Wisconsin, who have grown this crop, kind of get a little on the farm insight into various things that folks would want to consider if they're thinking about growing these crops. But this is part of a 4-webinar series. So today is the first, here on June 6th. If you have any interest at all, tomorrow there's going to be a webinar on winter camelina, same time. If you have an interest, the Zoom link is below. I'll throw that in the chat here after I kind of introduce everybody. And then next week, Tuesday and Wednesday, we have a call on Kernza, which is also part of this program, and then hybrid rye. So it's a 4-webinar series. And if you're not able to make any of these, or if you have to drop off, come in and out, please feel free. We will be recording these and uploading them to our YouTube channel moving forward here. I should also mention as well, I've also on the call from the Forever Green team, we've got Sienna Nesser as part of that team, and also Andrew Leach. So really pleased to have everybody's support, and Sienna was really instrumental in helping put together the Zoom and communicate with you all. Her and I specifically are going to be, kind of shepherding the EECO program moving forward. Andrew has some involvement with that as well, but also involvement in the kind of commercialization side of our efforts as well. So really pleased that you all could make it here today. Really appreciate your time. So very briefly, what is EECO? It's basically state of Minnesota funding support for early adoption of these forever green crops. So those 4 crops that I mentioned, hybrid rye, winter barley, winter camelina, and Kernza. And this is a continuation of a program that started last year, which was just focused on Kernza. So we've expanded those efforts to include some winter annuals as well. And the whole goal, in addition to the commercialization and kind of on-farm rollout, is to really address water quality issues in the state of Minnesota. So the area on the map there that you can see that's highlighted in yellow are all drinking water areas of the state that have been identified to have issues with water quality. And a large part of that is due to agriculture's impact on the landscape. So really the state of Minnesota and our efforts are all addressing kind of these water quality issues by incorporating more continuous living cover on the landscape. So that means perennial crops and winter annual crops, because those are going to tighten up our rotations, keep that brown soil covered with living roots in the soil, accumulate nitrates, and mitigate those issues of the leaky, annual crop systems that we have currently, which, don't protect that nitrogen from leaching out of the system. So the program is designed to address those issues. It is field-specific ecosystem service payments. So essentially, growers are being incentivized to plant these crops through an ecosystem service payment. It's a nitrogen modeling payment by field. So growers that are willing to sign up with this program get some of that. And it's really based on outcomes and, kind of a partnership program. So the map on the right here is the eligible counties for this EECO round 2. It's essentially the whole state, and it closely mirrors those areas of the state that are identified as being impaired drinking water areas, in addition to all the Indian nations as well. So the program specifics, it's focusing on those 4 crops, like I said, and it's really focusing on those impaired water quality areas of the state. So what is it getting, or what is the specifics of that? So my role specifically, and then in addition to the ecosystem service payment, there's also kind of a rudimentary crop insurance as well. So growers that, fail to market their crops or experience some sort of crop failure are eligible for half the cost of production of growing those 4 specific crops, in addition to some seed and grain testing as well. And our goal program-wide is to plant 5,000 acres between these 4 crops by 2024. And there is some specifics about, who's eligible and what type of acreage is eligible as well. If you have any questions like that, I'll drop my contact information and Sienna's into the chat too. Feel free to reach out to us. And this is, we're kind of letting the cat out of the bag, so to speak, on this program and trying to get garner some interest grower wide too. So if you have any interest, please feel free to share this. We're going to try to get the word out as much as possible about this program more widely. And like I said, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us. So with that, as a little bit of level setting, I am going to kick things over to UofM let's see. Why don't you try to screen share there, UofM, if you're able. All right.
Everybody see that?
Yep, looks good.
Now let's see if my going forward also works. Otherwise, you're just going to keep seeing this thing. No, I gotta go toggle now. Hey, well, the title kind of says it right there. I'm the kind of the bookends, and I think we're starting with on these 4 series of talks. I'm kind of the bookend, and we're starting probably with the least winter hardy, and we're probably ending with the most winter hardy of all our options. By the way, my name is Joachim Wiersma. I'm the small grains extension agronomist at the University of Minnesota. So I started playing with winter barley almost 15 years ago with some germplasm out of Germany. And this is a picture in the early years. Not much has changed. This is in Crookston, and the green that you see is actually the winter rye check plots. So there might be here and there a green plant, but a lot of times I can winter kill winter barley pretty readily. That doesn't look very hopeful. Now, why then still look at winter barley? Well, barley, spring barley, 6-row spring barley especially, has pretty much all but disappeared from Minnesota. And the domestic maltsters, one of which is in Shakopee, and that happens to be a very large one, are worried about domestic supply of good malting barley. The question then becomes, okay, can we migrate to winter barley? And the industry has a selfish interest in that that moves it to other areas of the country as well. Understand that, for instance, in Virginia, there's been a winter barley program for eons, and they produce very good malting barleys that are in many ways, very European. KWS, a German breeding company, is introducing some winter barleys also for the East Coast that work. We're a little bit different in that our winters are harsh. And so likewise on the West Coast, Oregon, a graduate from the University of Minnesota, Pat Hayes, has worked on winter barley also. Again, the winters aren't as harsh. The second interest, if we start looking at Forever Green as an overall approach, can winter barley mature early enough that we can start thinking about double cropping? So U of M's winter barley program, when Kevin Smith started it, he chose a very unique approach in that he didn't choose to go with true winter barleys, but actually with facultatives. What does that mean? It means that if you plant it in the spring, eventually day length will take over and it will still produce seed. What's the advantage of that? Is that you can speed up the breeding cycles in the early generations of your program because you don't have to vernalize your material for 10 weeks in a growth chamber. He also relies heavily on genomic predictions to speed up that program even further. So he's making crosses with materials when they're basically largely unknown yet of what they can actually do in the field. And he's having some success with it. And if we look at that, Equinox came out 2 years ago now. It is actually one of the most winter hardy winter barleys for this region. And it's you can raise it as a winter barley. It is a facultative, and Kurt Kimber has raised it as a spring barley for seed production, but it can be a winter barley and make it in Minnesota. Now, with that, because it's facultative, this is a picture of my winter wheat and winter rye variety trial in Crookston. And you can see we had a very dry fall last fall. I have some Equinox there that is headed also. It made it through the winter. It has enough winter hardiness that when we had eventually some rain and we had a little bit of volunteers start to grow last fall, I now have a very nice carpet of Equinox in between basically in the alleys. So I'm going to have to clean that up, but that's right away. I hadn't thought about it, but when you don't want it to survive, it does. So establishment and previous crop, as an absolute minimum, you're going to no-till this. And the taller the stubble, the better off you are, because you will need snow to make this survive. When you do that, cereals, an oat stubble would be a good choice. You can use soybeans, but in many cases, that doesn't give you enough stubble to really matter. When you start using another cereal, the last picture you saw there really tells the story. You have to manage your volunteer with glyphosate if you want to keep that stubble standing and not use tillage, because you need to disrupt the green bridge, and you don't want to have mixed classes of rye or say winter wheat mixed in with your barley when you want to bring it to a malt plant. Now, the seeding rate and depth, pretty much the same as spring wheat. Be careful not to go too deep with barley because it has the least tolerance overall for seeding depth. So an inch, inch and a half, which if we have dry falls, going to make it challenging. We did work right away when we start looking at winter barley on seeding time, and basically the window is very, very similar to that of winter wheat. So in the southern part of the state, October 1st is probably ideal. Northern part of the state, September 15th. It doesn't do the crop any good to go any earlier. It actually will increase winter kill. If it gets too lush in the fall, it seems like it gets to winter kill. Ideally, you want to have a winter barley plant that has started to tiller and fill in the field, but not be like, what would be a good, you don't want it to be a overgrown lawn because it will winter kill.
Hey, Joachim, real
Yeah.
quick, we had a question about the green bridge. Can you just explain that briefly about what you mean there?
Okay, green bridge. So green bridge is when you have basically last season's crop and this coming season's crop present at the same time, where aphids, for instance, can jump from that last little bit of green material that was last year's crop to your new seedlings. Likewise, there's a bunch of fungi that can jump then also to the new crop. We have a bunch of viral diseases, barley yellow dwarf being probably the most common one, that will then wreak havoc on that newly seeded fall crop. And so that's what we call the green bridge, and you want to separate those two crops spatially and or temporally far enough away from each other that you do not create that opportunity for those fall infections to occur. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
So fall fertility management, I would not go any further than starter fertilizer in the fall. And only if I'm really on a little bit of the lighter ground. For most other ground, I would not use any starter fertilizer. You're going to have to make the decision, and it has to do also with the likelihood of the crop actually making it. I think the spring fertility management is going to be the second most difficult part of raising winter barley. You want this crop to have its nitrogen needs met early in the season, but unfortunately, winter barley has to literally come back from the dead. It looks like, compared to winter wheat or winter rye, which green up much sooner. And so you don't know if you actually have a stand when you normally would fertilize winter wheat and winter rye and hybrid rye. I would not over fertilize. If you have experiences with spring barley, I would keep it at 2/3 of that, simply because the yield potential of Equinox isn't what our best spring barleys can do at this point in time. And this is the most difficult part, the spring stand evaluation. It's much slower to green up. And I would say in a no-till situation, you have a 50-50 odds of making it and have a salvageable stand. And for me, salvageable means 17 plants per square foot across the field. Now, more than likely, if you have any topography in those fields and some of the hilltops the snow blew off, you will see stands from 0 to 80% of your fall stand. Likewise, anytime where there is ponding, expect the stand to be 0. Both other winter cereals are a little hardier or a lot hardier than winter barley is in Minnesota at this point in time. And because you have this uneven stand and this slow green up, the early emerging annuals, the redwood pigweeds, the wild mustards, the wild oats, have an advantage. Likewise, any winter annuals that emerged after the burn down, so your shepherd's purse and a couple others, or thistles, will have a competitive advantage. And we have options, but not enough options to really get good control once those get too large. Disease management. Yep, call me. We're going to have to be relatively aggressive because right now Kevin has to focus on winter hardiness. And so the materials tend to be more susceptible to net plots, to spot plots. We're going to see probably some diseases that we normally don't see in spring barley, like scald. And of course, Fusarium head blight is always going to be in the forefront of our disease management. Harvest management, be aggressive, in part because equinox can shatter a little bit. Point in case was the picture with the volunteers, which that field got cut basically probably 2-3 days too late. I would start cutting at 18% moisture and use natural air to dry down the grain further. And that really will help you to maintain color and test weight of the harvested grain. So I'm kind of, a Debbie Downer here, but in a way, right now, I would only play with equinox on small acreage to get a feel for this crop that, to me, is not ready for prime time in Minnesota. There's other parts where in the Midwest, where winters are milder and snow cover is more guaranteed, that if you're in the same latitude, because the barleys are daylight sensitive, you have probably a better chance of making it.
So just to thank you, UofM. I really appreciate that background information. And I'm gonna try to turn that frown upside down on winter barley a little bit. Just saying. But what do you see any regionality, from north to south on winter barley? In terms of like, is there survival better in the southern portion versus the north, or is it you seeing?
No, so you can kill it easier in Northwest Minnesota, very easy in Northwest Minnesota. But you can kill it just as easy in Lamberton or in Rochester. Snow is absolutely critical, not necessarily, well, it's critical in January, but when it's most critical is probably in the month of March. Our black soils tend to warm up very, very quickly when they get sun. And the sun has enough power in March to really get that, in a way, break the dormancy. And that's the nail in the coffin for winter barley.
Gotcha. And there was a question about why the spring barley supply is declining. And there are reasons it's not viable in Minnesota. I think I know the answer to that, but can you comment on that?
It's all about price. It is as simple as that. Yes, in the mid-90s, when with the Fusarium head blight, Anheuser-Busch used to have a series of elevators throughout Northwest Minnesota. They eventually sold those in the early 2000s because the acreage migrated west to central North Dakota and now even western North Dakota. Canada is a major supplier now, and the domestic supply has dwindled and the acreage has dwindled. And in Northwest Minnesota and West Central Minnesota, which actually had a fair amount of acreage, even through the 90s, corn and beans are more profitable. If you go really back in the 30s, when there was every single town in southern Minnesota had its own brewery, just in the triangle between Albert Lee, the cities, and Rochester, there was 350,000 acres of barley.
Wow. Interesting how much things change. The question about winter barley would be viable in Iowa. Any comment there?
Yeah, I would still do no-till. I would still, depending on where you're at in Iowa, the things we have to learn when we migrate that germplasm that way is how it responds to day length, and whether or not that allows it to really flourish. I think cool months of May really help the crop. If we get warm up too quick, which as you go further west is more likely, that will set the crop back. It really is a cool season. The winter barley really acts like a cool season grass.
Gotcha. Thank you. And there's a couple questions on marketing. I think, I don't want to go too far out ahead of where things are at right now, but like UofM mentioned, there is some discussions with, RAR and some other folks about, it has passed their malting test. Whether that'll turn into a localized contract kind of remains to be seen. Typically, the malting and brewing industry is fairly vertically integrated when it comes to what varieties they want, things like that. So there is value-added markets for organic barley, for milling companies like a grain millers, places like that. You can often, gain some sort of premium there. And I think winter barley, assuming it meets their quality and cleanliness specs, that could be a viable market for winter barley. Also feed as well. And we'll hear some from a grower here in a little bit about, that's a real potential benefit as well. In terms of marketing. UofM, any comments about organic cultural practices? I know we have several organic folks on the call here. Fertility, weed control, etc.
It all gets harder. The weed, because you need to use tillage and rotary hose in the weed management. No-till can be done. We have to pick our battles as far as what previous crop we want to use, but it's doable. The biggest worry I have is weed management. If you don't have it green up early enough, that some of your interannuals and some of your cool season spring annuals get ahead of you. For the rest, disease management and everything else, the risks are different. Winter barley can escape Fusarium head blight, just like winter rye can, but you're relying on escape more so than resistance. There's no immunity for Fusarium head blight in equinox or any barley for that matter. And the brewing industry is very, very particular about DON content. And for good reason. It causes, once you get above 2 to 3 parts per million of DON, there's this, you have some starch damage, which changes your, basically your percent extract. But the biggest problem is there's this concept called gushing, where the beer pours itself the moment you open the bottle or the can. So it's doable, but it's challenging to make. Now, can we get there? I think that's with what Kevin does and how he's approached it. We will get better winter hardiness over time. Will it ever rival that of winter wheat or winter rye? It will be acceptable, but think of it as the winter wheats from Kansas. We can winter kill those in Minnesota under the wrong conditions. And I think that's where we're going to probably end up, is that we're going to have genetics that are decent, if we can guarantee or improve our odds with snow cover, that becomes a much more viable crop. What I'm really looking forward in this next round of breeding material is that it wakes up a little earlier and it doesn't look like it has to come back from the dead. And I've seen some stuff in his early season nursery, of his early generation nurseries, that looks already better than Equinox.
Yeah, I've definitely, in my limited contact, I've come across folks that have seen that same thing, even in southern Wisconsin. It looks like the winter barley has to come back all the way from the dead, like you're saying. It looks, the stand looks dead, but after 3 or 4 weeks, it'll come back. But yeah, it has to put a lot of resources into regrowing all that material. And there was a question earlier too about is Equinox the best variety? I mean, I can speak a little bit about. I spent the last 12 years as an agronomist with a regional seed company called Albert Lee Seed, and we tried many different winter barleys for production in the upper Midwest, and a lot of them were pretty much non-starters because of that winter survival issue. I mean, UofM mentioned the winter survival issue with Equinox, but the other winter barleys even had worse winter hardiness. So yes, I would say for the upper Midwest, Equinox is probably one of your best varieties just based on that alone, but you got to take those other considerations that he mentioned into account. Planting date, field placement, pretty important. Sheltered fields are probably a better bet than wide open, windy, windswept fields. There is some other varieties, maybe out there that, are in development, but yeah, I would say for folks in this region, Equinox is probably one of your better varieties to utilize. Let me see if I'm getting through. Fertility, organic fertility, a lot of folks are using manure, fall applied. Is that still play with winter barley, or what do you think there?
Yeah, the reason I say do everything in the spring is the objective there is risk management, of minimizing your expenses and creating flexibility should you decide to migrate those acres into soybeans where you don't need the fertility, at least not the nitrogen. And so it's a risk avoidance by saying, well, I'll not use any starter or don't use a fall applied N. When you hear me talk about winter rye, that story flips completely around because it's hard to kill winter rye in the winter. And so if you're in an organic system, getting the nitrogen on in the fall is probably, manure as a source, is your primary source of fertility. Yeah, fall applied. You have to.
Gotcha. Well, great. Well, I really appreciate your time and contribution, UofM. If you've got to drop off, please feel free. But if you're able to stick around, if questions come up, kind of leave those to you.
I'll stick around.
Great. Well, thank you again. Really appreciate your time and contribution to this. Really appreciate it. So in our last, 20 minutes or so, we're going to transition to kind of some on-farm snapshot here. So start things off with UofM mentioned Kurt Kimber. He's a grower southeast Minnesota, who had grown some Equinox. Kurt, I'll kind of pass things over to you in terms of what you want to tell folks about your experience with growing Equinox.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. All right. Let me see. I think it was lose track of the years here, but I think it was last year. We grew Equinox 4-seed for Albert Lee Seed, and Albert Lee Seed wanted it planted in the spring to try to reduce any winter rye seed that was in the harvested seed. So I'm thinking if there was some winter rye contamination, but you planted in the spring, winter rye wouldn't get vernalized, so you wouldn't get any seed production from the winter rye, and that would help clean it up. So yeah, so just challenge, dealing with the weather. So last year was so the year we planted it, I could be off a year here, sorry, but the year we planted it, it was it reminded me a lot of this spring, where it was cold, it was wet, it was late. And then I guess that's one theme I'm seeing in farming, is that the windows for execution of field work are shrinking. And we were in a situation where we had a window where we could plant, but rain was forecast. And it was such that we skipped the tillage operation and no-tilled the winter barley, or no-tilled the equinox in. And so that was our planting situation. And not surprisingly, we had a lot of weed pressure from that. I guess, kind of two things against you, right? We were planting late, which puts the cool season annuals at a disadvantage. And then also we missed our typical tillage operation, but we were able to get a crop. But the thing that was probably something that was very interesting was that the equinox was probably the shortest small grain I had ever seen. Yeah, it was not knee high, I don't think. And so it was tall enough to swath, but there wasn't much extra besides that. I
can definitely corroborate that. I went out to your production field with my at the time 2-year-old daughter, and it was even a little shorter than her. So yeah, definitely matured very, very early. I think it was heading out sometime in, and drying down by mid-June.
Yeah. But it still didn't beat the thistles, the Canada thistles blooming. So yeah, so we're an organic system, and so Canada thistles are one of our perennial challenges. So I think then marketing is always critical, and so growing the seed for Albert Lee seed, we had a guaranteed market for it, so that was a plus for us. So I think maybe that's my comments right now, and I can chime in, and I possibly have some other questions to throw at UofM, but back to you, Matt.
Got you. Thanks, Kurt. Appreciate your insight there. What did you end up getting for yield on the winter barley? Do you know?
It was in the 20s.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I don't know. What's the range for Equinox? Any idea?
I mean, UofM might have more of a statewide understanding there. I mean, for organic spring barley, I would say, 40 is probably pretty good on organic ground, but I don't know. UofM, do you have any comments there?
I've had it in the plots in the mid-70s, but that's under conventional management, where the spring wheats, like I said, the spring barleys are tickling 3 digits. So we have a yield gap there too yet, that we haven't overcome yet. And that's to be expected. It's in a way we're creating a new crop for the state. And so that's where that fertility recommendation also came from. Don't go over 2/3 of what you are comfortable with spring barley.
Great. So for another grower snapshot, I really appreciate Chris Wilson, Southern Wisconsin, being willing to jump in here on the relatively short notice to give us a little insight as to his experience growing winter barley. Chris, if you want to give people an idea of where you're at And then,
Sure.
yeah, take it away.
Can you guys see my screen? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, so we're located down here in the southwest corner of Wisconsin, which for the Minnesota area is about a grade warmer on the plant hardiness scale. It's in theory about 5 degrees warmer on average in those winters. We're more in the middle of it, so we're probably maybe not quite at 5 degrees, but that's where we're located. We actually grew winter barley in 2012, 2013, 2014, had real good success with 2012 drought, and then not so much success after that. Came back to it in 2019 and started growing it each year, and started out on just a few acres and kind of built out from there. And this last year we grew 80 acres of it. This year, just for rotation reasons, we did drop back to about 30 acres, but hoping to get it on more this coming year. We are an organic operation, so we typically are including it within our rotation for different reasons. We typically will follow a corn silage just because of planting date. So we're taking off a corn silage and trying to get that barley in. For us, the prime window that we're shooting for is somewhere between September 10th and September 25th, ideally probably around that 15th to 20th. We did in 2022, fall of 2021, we planned it September, I believe September 8th or 9th. And then this is what it looked like heading into winter. And we had a fairly warm fall that year, so quite a bit of green cover. Tillering was really good, 4 or 5 plants. And to a certain degree, maybe this was too lush because we did come out of that spring and we had, as UofM and Matt were talking about, sort of that heavy brown residue that kind of limited or took a lot of resources maybe to pull out of. We had somewhat of an open and fairly cold winter, so the fact that it survived was in the prior 2 winters that we'd grown it, we had perfect winters. We got snow cover early, it stayed on. The winter of 2021, 22, we basically had no snow cover most of the January and February, and extremely cold temperatures at times. So I was surprised it came out. And that was, I guess, just rewind a little bit. Those years we were growing what's called thoroughbred. It's a line out of Virginia, University of Virginia from 2004, 2005. And it was something that I'd researched and found to have good winter hardiness. So that's what we grew those 2 years. So this is kind of a picture of what it looks like in the spring coming out of it. And then in May 25th, after it was starting to head out. I will say, there was good population, good tillering, but the heads were extremely small. We also grew a different variety called SB 151, which had bigger heads on it, but we ran into problems with lodging on that, which I'm not sure is entirely variety specific. So one of the things that we've learned is that you really got to be careful about overfeeding winter barley. Winter wheat, we often will top dress in the spring. So we applied that same idea. Top dress with chicken litter is what we use, and we applied that same thing to winter barley, and we've run into lodging problems. So this year we basically didn't apply any fertilizer, but we do have a rotation in our system that provides a nitrogen credit. So it's coming off of 2nd year credits of alfalfa, so we get some nitrogen credits there. It's planted on a manure ground, so we have manure from the prior spring or fall that 2nd year credits. And then it's on, most of our ground is running, you know, close to 4% organic matter. So between those three variables, we often have more nitrogen than we need. And we're checking the boxes in the other areas. So that's kind of the rundown there. So we planted all Minnesota equinox on the field this last fall. We planted it on September 24th, a little bit later in the window. However, the green up this spring was excellent. Again, I was pretty nervous that it wasn't going to make it through. Pretty harsh winter. Basically no snow cover on this field most of the winter, and it started to green up right along with the winter wheat that we grow. So this was April 7th pictures. And then we had, you know, May 10th at boot stage. We did go in, we're trying some biologicals this year, so we did apply some then. And then this was about 10 days ago, is what the field looked like. Kind of early soft dough stage, and now we're moving progressionally. I think we'll be able to harvest this field in 10 to 15 days, kind of in that window. So, and then the goal is, if we get any rain, we'll go in and plant soybeans, which we did last year, and had a lot of success with that.
You're saying after the barley comes off?
Yeah. Yep.
Okay, cool. Do you Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry. I was just gonna say, we plant our soybeans usually around June, first week of June. So the thought with the winter barley is that we could get keep it green all spring, have that cover crop that turns into a cash crop, and then still be able to grow a fairly good soybean crop after it that we don't have to fight weeds as much on, because it's planted later.
Very cool. Do you have to reduce the maturity of your bean at all? Or I suppose not, because you're planting in June.
If we can get it in by July 1st, our goal is to use the same maturity as we would, so that it gets some height before it starts to, you know, enough nodes that it's actually before it starts to flower and everything else. So that's, if it gets later than July 1st, last year we planted our beans on June 28th. We fortunately got a rain basically the same night, and it was out of the ground a few days later. So the beans did awesome. Had hardly any weed pressure. So that checked all those boxes. But yeah, I think, you know, they did get nipped off in the fall. We feed soybeans, roasted soybeans, so we just kept those separate and fed them to our livestock. So we kind of had the advantage there. If we would have had to sell them, we probably would have had some dockage on it. But we had an early frost too. I think if it would have had another week, we'd have been fine.
Gotcha. And when you're planting in corn silage, did you kind of chop that down, or did you work it black, or how did that go?
Yeah, so we did a single pass with a vertical tiller. Basically hit it with a VT once, and went in with a drill and planted almost right after it. Hit it and planted. And that's winter wheat. We'll plant winter wheat, and we also do rye. We plant that after snaplage and then dry corn. We will go in and run the mulcher behind that, and before we work it in. Oftentimes we'll work that in with a little bit more of an aggressive, still a vertical till unit, but it's called a limpkin, that gets a little bit deeper and can throw stuff a little bit more for that seed bed.
Gotcha. Thanks, Chris. Really appreciate the insight and kind of the on the ground information with your experience with this. There was a couple questions about lodging with winter barley. I think it's more of a concern with equinox. You know, there is kind of a very clear watch out on that variety in particular, that once it starts drying down, like UofM was saying, that you really want to take it on the wetter side and dry it with air if at all possible. Because if you let it go stand too long, it'll start, you know, shattering and kind of falling apart. So with that variety particularly, you want to get on top of it. In general, barley's already earlier than other small grains, and so you can take them earlier. But yeah, with equinox, you definitely want to take it a little bit on the early side.
Yep. And that's actually, I guess, as far as markets go, we've grown spring barley, and we've always had, we have higher dawn spores in all our spring barley because we don't harvest it till July. The humidity tends to pick up more after the 1st of July in our area, which feeds that fusarium and other diseases. So this would be the 4th year. Prior 3 years I've tested, and our dawn scores have been in, sub 1 on all 3 of those years. So our goal is to continue to try to hit those food grade markets, and as we build it out, hopefully we can, develop an organic barley malting market, and that's one of the projects that we're working on in Wisconsin to try to get more organic beer, I guess, out there. Would be the hope.
Yeah, it'd be great to have those options for Minnesota as well. It just seems like it's ripe for some entrepreneurial person to take up the mantle on, Midwestern winter barley to protect water quality, and have a nice label you could put on a beer bottle.
Yep.
Joachim, maybe you can answer this last question here in our last few minutes. Do you know if there's any other future varietal releases from University of Minnesota coming down the pipe, or?
No, I don't know I've seen some of the lines, but I don't know where they're at as far as testing. Kevin will try to get malting quality right away into those materials. And I haven't heard if he has submitted one for what we call the pilot scale testing, because that would be the next big hurdle. For in an integrated system and an organic system, one of the options you have is to work directly with some brewers and some of the smaller malting companies to see if the big guys want to have consistency and they want to have a large volume. The smaller micro maltsters can do more things. And if the brewer is willing to, and excuse my friends, get off their high horse, you can brew beer out of Equinox in many ways. And that's but that requires a lot of legwork on your behalf. And the first question you always ask a brewer to gauge where they're at is ask if they think of malt as basically crystal sugar, or if they think of it as a tomato. If they answer tomato, you have somebody you can work with. If they talk about it being sugar as an ingredient that is the same every single time, has very stable shelf life, does the same thing every single time, that's probably not the brewer you want to work with.
Yeah, I'll second that experience. I've been interested in trying to develop the malting market in Wisconsin, the organic malting market, and I finally found the right group that basically told me that if I can grow food grade barley, they don't really care, outside the Dawn score, and then try to keep those protein levels down. Outside of that, they don't care. They'll creatively make a product out of it, right? They'll take what they have, the canvas that they have, and they'll be artists from that versus asking for a perfect canvas to start from. So yeah, it's absolutely who you can find out there that's willing to think out of the box.
Great. Well, really appreciate everybody's time. We're kind of nearing time here. So just want to say again, thank you to you all for joining us. Thank you to Joachim and Kurt and Chris for joining in the call today. Really appreciate everybody's insights into this crop. We dropped some information about the EECO program and Sienna and I's contact information. If you have any questions or follow up after this, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. We'll be happy to connect you accordingly if you have any questions moving forward. And just as another call out, we do have the winter camelina call same time tomorrow if you have an interest in that crop. Otherwise, hope you all have a good end of planting season here, and we'll connect sometime down the road. So take care.